and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. We'll be talking about an incident that took place last week in the UK, where a 20-year-old individual fatally stabbed to death two Londoners on the famous London Bridge. Now, this 28-year-old's name was Usman Khan. He's been making the headlines. He's a British national from Staffordshire, born and raised in the UK. And he was essentially shot dead by the police after carrying out this heinous attack with a knife, at the same time threatening to blow himself up with what turned out to be a fake improvised explosive device on his chest. Now, since then, many have rushed to the conclusion that he was a Pakistani Muslim carrying out hate crimes, in turn making the general Muslim population and Pakistanis especially accomplices to this crime. Indian attempts continued late in the day to somehow link Usman Khan with Pakistan, but it turns out that British media itself has continued reporting, quoting court papers, intelligence officers, all who have confirmed that Khan was a complete local extremism issue and had nothing to do with Pakistan. Now, a little bit about this individual. Usman Khan was convicted back in 2012, along with 8 other accomplices of a Al-Qaeda-inspired terrorism group that they were plotting in different terror attacks in London. Now, he was sent to jail under a controversial sentence of imprisonment for public protection in 2012. Now, this essentially allowed him to be held in prison indefinitely with no minimum term until a parole board agreed that he was no longer a threat to the society. Let me read out, however, what happened is that the parole board came out with a statement saying that they never reviewed his case. Let me read out what they said. The parole board can confirm it had no involvement with the release of the individual identified as the attacker, who appears to have been released automatically on license without ever being referred to the board. Now, this poses a rather disturbing question out in the public, whether the judicial system itself and the way counterterrorism efforts are carried out in the UK might be at risk of not carrying out their responsibilities with due justice. Now, that also whether a case like this reflects on the kind of Islamophobic atmosphere that might be exceedingly getting worse in the UK. We'll be finding out from our guests. Let me introduce who will be joining us on this complicated debate today. We have with us Mr. Henry Bolton, a British politician who is joining us from London right now. We have Mr. Robbie Travers. He's a political commentator also joining us right now from London. And Dr. Khalid Zaheer, the Vice President of Al-Maurid Institute. He is joining us from Lahore. Welcome to all three of you to this conversation here on Newswire. I want to start with you, Mr. Bolton. You're sitting in the heart of the city where essentially this took place. Tell us a little about what the sentiment is right now amongst the political leadership of this heinous act that has been carried out, the way reports are coming out highlighting how this individual might have just been released too early and this could have been avoided.
We're in the middle of a general election campaign here, so of course politicians are jumping all over this and a number of other issues to try and demonstrate to the British public that they are engaged on things that concern them. But the sentiment here really is one of quite some shock, I think, across the board that this individual was released early. There are questions obviously being asked, and there is a long history over the last 10, 15 years of cutbacks to our probation service and even indeed our prisons, and also an element of outsourcing and privatization of these public services. And the question, I think, has to be asked whether or not successive governments have used these services as an opportunity to cut resources, to cut the budgets, save money, and as a result, we've seen an inability of people like the probation service to respond appropriately to threats in terms of released prisoners. The other thing is that we've had I think we've got a real naivety amongst some of our political class, within our civil service, and members of the public. This country has, although we've suffered terrorist incidents, we've actually had it pretty comfortable for a long time. And I think people do not realize that there are some individuals in every society that are a fundamental threat to public safety. And for these people, it's not good enough for them to say, oh, I've reformed, oh, I've seen the error of my ways. These people are intrinsically dangerous, and if they've got some ideological motivation behind them that has not been, it's very difficult to expunge that totally. I think there are a number of issues that we need to be asking ourselves about how we've dealt with, as a nation with this entire thing. And there's a lot of depth to the problem. And just to finally, if I may, just you mentioned India. As far as I know, there is absolutely no link whatsoever between this individual and Pakistan. And in terms of the UK perception on from a Pakistani perspective or Muslim, I think there is a general concern here because we've had a number of jihadi-motivated terrorist incidents. But ultimately, this is not an anti-Muslim thing, although some extremists may use that as an excuse.
There are some really interesting points you've raised, Mr. Bolton, especially on the concern that releasing such individuals early before the sentence period is completed is a big concern, something that the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has also raised and commented on right after this incident. Let's listen to what he just said.
I have long argued that it is a mistake to allow serious and violent criminals to come out of prison early, and it is very important that we get out of that habit and that we enforce the appropriate sentences for dangerous criminals, especially for terrorists that I think the public want to see.
So you heard there Mr. Boris Johnson there. Mr. Travers, coming to you, the IPP, the imprisonment for public protection, which was under what Mr. Usman Khan went to jail, that essentially put him indefinitely in detention until, of course, a review was done by a parole board. Now, this IPP, tell us a little about the controversy behind it, the indefinite period for which those jailed would go behind bars, and also how it ended up being abolished by the Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition government back in December 2012.
Well, the IPP has always been controversial, rightly, for you identified the problem with it, because it essentially, in the eyes of many, indefinitely holds someone as a prisoner, and essentially it imprisons them without any form of review and permanently. And some people obviously have deep problems with this, largely, and they would argue because this does not allow for review of sentencing, and moreover, and more problematically, they would argue that everyone should have a set sentence when they are sentenced rather than being kept inside a prison. Now, obviously, there's been a real kind of ferocious debate in the UK between Yvette Cooper, who was the Shadow Home Secretary, and Priti Patel, who is the current Home Secretary, over what exactly happened to allow Usman Khan to be released. And I think actually, I think this whole debate about the legal nuances is actually missing the point slightly, because if we look at the judgment that was made, Lord Justice Levison in 2013, who was the judge overseeing it, declared that Khan posed no credible threat and continued to be minimum danger to our society, despite being presented evidence of extreme Islamist beliefs, including race hatred and hatred of Jews, and also extreme views on the British public and the role of the British state. So what concerns me is that a judge who reviewed this in 2013 found, despite all the evidence that showed extreme views, that there was actually no threat to the British public, or very minimum threat at least, as Lord Justice Levison said, there was little to minimum threat. So how did a British judge get this so badly wrong when presented with evidence? I think actually Mr. Bolton pointed out something that was quite wise, actually, that I think we've become slightly complacent on these issues because we have such a good security services, and we think that we can reform, that perhaps we are being too complacent.
Okay, so this question about whether saying we've become too complacent is something I want to address. But before that, Mr. Zaheer, coming to the question of whether this kind of a flawed judicial system, where in the case of Usman Khan, as his lawyer said back in 2013 when they were trying to appeal the sentence, that a total of 4 minutes of a phone conversation was recorded by the authorities where Mr. Khan and his accomplices discussed about blowing up places in the UK. And he essentially summarized it as anybody could have come across and said something violent in anger because they were reacting to incidents of racism and against Muslims in Stoke that had happened in the UK back then. Dr. Zaheer, my question essentially is this entire system of bugging phone calls and trying to sort of gather evidence strong enough to put somebody in jail for 16 to 18 years. Could this possibly backfire in terms of keeping a society safe?
Most certainly it could, because obviously when there is this perception that living in a society where these people think that they are in a minority, and there is a perception, rightly or wrongly is a different debate, that many of them are marginalized. If they get an impression that the way they are being treated is unfair to them, obviously there has to be a reaction, a resentment, and a feeling of being treated unfairly. However, let me also mention the fact that we all know that even though a vast majority of Muslims are peace-loving, there is a tiny minority which is very strongly influenced by a narrative which causes people to have a very strongly negative attitude towards non-Muslims. And young people, young Muslims in particular, are more vulnerable, more particularly when they get an impression, rightly or wrongly, that they are being marginalized. Mm-hmm. So what I feel is that it's absolutely essential that on the one hand, the British government makes sure that justice should be done to all people living in the society equally and fairly. They should also make sure that the manner these youngsters are getting their religious education and training should be improved, should be looked at from the point of view of the narrative that are more moderate, more accommodating, and more inclusive. I think very little has been done in that particular area. And I have always been saying and urging the British officials that they need to very seriously look into the manner religion is being taught. I'm told that they're making, but I think it's still far too little that they have done in order for the Muslim and other religious populations of the country to talk about religion in a manner that they are talking about inclusiveness rather than the exclusive attitude which some of the pockets of the population are at the moment are displaying and experiencing.
It's almost like, and Mr. Bolton addressed this question to you, it's almost like as if in isolation these communities are going forward, and instead of the diversity that London is known for, they're becoming more and more isolated from each other. In fact, in June this year, there was a very disturbing outcome of a poll carried out by YouGov for Hope for Hate, which highlighted how the political leadership, the Conservative Party, a disturbing majority of them actually believed some very huge myths. Like, let me just read out some of the numbers. 67% believed the lie that there are areas in Britain that operate under the Sharia law. Then another number, 43% preferred that the entry of a Muslim, preferred that Muslims do not enter the country as immigrants. 39% of members believe that Islamist terrorists reflected widespread hostility to Britain amongst the Muslim community. Do you see these numbers acting out in real life in terms of the kind of policies that are made as a result of them?
No, I don't. Not in general day-to-day life. And I think these polls are always a little bit tricky. How big is the number of people who were polled, for example, but I mean, look at the mayor of London is a Muslim. It's not that there's not opportunity for Muslims in this country, or that in any way there's any policy, sort of national policy or legislation or directives or anything of that sort that suppresses in any way the Muslim religion or for that matter, any other. There is a problem more deeply in British society whereby we have talked about different identities, whether it's a religious identity or a racial identity or some other cultural or even genetic or gender type of identity. And we have, by doing that, we highlight differences. Rather than saying we are all one people here, we are all British people, born and bred, or people who have come here to live here and make a life for themselves here, we are all one community. We are highlighting in our society the differences between different groups within our community. And that I've always felt is a very unhealthy thing, because then people start to be competitive with each other. They look at the other group and say, what do they have that we don't have? And it starts to become tense and brings conflict, and exactly the sort of thing that your previous speaker was talking about emerges. But there is no policy that is causing this, apart from I would say, the liberal sort of identity politics, and I think they're massively dangerous. We need another unifying element. We in a sense, as the British people, need to rediscover our unity as British, as a population made up of different people from different backgrounds, but with that one thing in common: we are all British and we're all on the same team together. That is missing, and in fact, many of our communities, whether it be the Muslim community or the Jewish community or the Anglican community or the black community or the Chinese community, we all highlight our differences, that we are a different, we're all one. That's the problem.
Okay, so that's an interesting point. What we've done right now is that not only was the judicial system here in question, the counterterrorism efforts in question, but also in terms of how the community in itself in the UK is standing on its feet right now. Is it with its diversity? Are they getting along, or is that a sort of isolation perpetuated by policy? But Mr. Travers, I also want to bring in here a more sort of international viewpoint. This kind of Islamophobia, is it an Islamophobia to have led Usman Khan on the streets to become so radicalized, to be stabbing people left, right, and center, threatening to blow himself up? And does that reflect in the overall things, the way they are unfolding on the international sphere with sort of Muslims and Muslim countries and individuals and how they see Islam?
I actually think there's a really important point here, which is there seems to be a feedback going on which benefits extremists. And I think it's largely between, in Western countries, what I would call a white supremacist element and Islamic extremism. And what seems to be happening is we seem to see a binary emerging, because these extremes almost feed off each other. We see when an Islamic extremist attack happens, when these Islamist attacks, happen, what we see in the immediate aftermath is people desperate in many senses to blame many Muslims who have nothing to do with it in any way and blame them for the responsibility. And then we see on the opposite side, the poll about many Muslims who feel so aggrieved that they are so blamed, then doing almost the exact same in response sometimes to other attacks. And this is benefiting extremists. They're playing these narratives. They're playing Muslims of other communities. And actually, the tension here is really worrying. And the other thing I have to say is that we have to be very careful about how things are reported. Your earlier address to Mr. Bolton, a question about Pakistan, and this fake news has actually come from reputable organisations that apparently crusade against fake news. CNN have said that Mr. Khan was originally Pakistani, born in Pakistan. Fox News, born in Pakistan. MSNBC, Pakistani origin, Pakistani born. Mr. Khan may have had Pakistani parents, but he was born on Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire in the United Kingdom. And what happens with this false reporting is that it has built up a narrative that has allowed extremists in India and other countries to use it to demonize immigrants simply from a false report. And that's why it's so important that our reporting is factual and that we are not taking narratives that are fundamentally incorrect and allowing them to be used with racism. That's why it's so important that in this age of Twitter, I think we all need to slow down slightly with terrorist attacks. And rather than turning to Twitter and believing the first thing we read, waiting to see. And I think just kind of finally, if I can, I think that I actually do not know the exact details of why Mr. Khan was radicalized. I think I'd rather wait for a report on that to show the full details rather than opine on it, because I think we need to also be brave enough in this society for people who are in positions of power and political people and judicial people to actually say, I don't know, and we need to investigate that further.
That's a really important point you've raised, Travers. Dr. Zaheer, I want to come to you on this, so I could get your thoughts on this as well. The immediate impact that the media makes reporting on a story, especially in the case of Usman Khan, and we've seen the reactions coming, the kind of endorsements coming from extremist groups. In this case, ISIS turns out and says, yes, this is part of our work, he's related to us, like in sort of taking credit in a way, even if it had nothing to do with them, and sort of pushing the narrative that terrorism is rampant and their network is wide and spread about. It's a real concern, isn't it, Dr. Zaheer?
It indeed is. And I think media has a very important role to play in lessening the tension that's there and in making sure that even if there are some such unfortunate incidents taking place, they're not reported in a manner that could cause further damage. However, let's face the reality that there are different networks that actually are making their best efforts to create extremism amongst Muslims. And I think that's one area that we must focus on. Mm-hmm. There is a narrative. You see, when you talk to a religious person from the point of view of religious text, he or she is not going to listen to anything else save what is being put across to him or her from religious point of view from their God. Now, what these people are saying is not what the mainstream Muslim understanding, Muslim scholarship is saying. However, they are not confronted properly. Their concerns are not responded to. And as a result, it seems as if there is this deeply, residing hatred that they are all entertaining all the time. Mm-hmm. Most certainly, justice and fair play in the society is going to lessen that tension. Most certainly, if media is more responsible, things are going to get better. However, the problem cannot be removed completely unless we confront that narrative, which I insist is widespread. It's mm-hmm. threatening. It's scary, but it has very weak academic basis. So it can be confronted. It needs to be addressed. We must talk about it. We must tell these youngsters that what you are hearing is only one side of the story, which is not strongly, properly grounded in the text. I think this is an area where we need to do a lot more work.
The profile of Usman Khan, and if we remove the name Usman Khan and we just look at what the background of this individual was, the way he was raised, the kind of environment he was raised in, he was bullied in school, reports are coming in, he tried very hard to fit in, he couldn't, in a largely white public school, there was a very small group of Asians. I mean, you wouldn't be able to really tell, Mr. Bolton, I guess what I'm trying to say is that if you were to take a case, a background of a white supremacist gone on a killing rampage and someone like Usman Khan, you would see the same troubled childhood, the same trouble of assimilating in a society, and then how it is being addressed by those who do detain them on charges of terrorism. And in this case, when reports come in that he did ask for, while he was incarcerated, that he did ask for a sort of psychological help, that he saw the problem in his ways. According to his lawyer, Wajahat Sharif, who spoke to The Guardian, saying that he did seek out help, it really brings up the problem that you and Dr. Zaheer and Mr. Travers also highlighted, that how is this being addressed in society before it's too late when a person is already radicalized?
Well, I think this we're getting to the real nub of the problem here to some extent. First of all, I've worked on researching extremism both in Belgium and in Austria, and I've found that in both of those places, the people who are brought into these sort of networks where they become vulnerable to radicalization are often, and this may not be the case in other countries, but in Europe it seems to be the case, that they are often people who are they've got some sort of social difficulty. They might be slightly Asperger's, or they have some problem in relating to other people. They have been bullied at school. They're loners. They tend to sit in their rooms at night instead of going out with friends. They don't have a big circle of friends. And then they are taken in and they're given a cause. They're given some sort of reason for being. And young men they strive for a purpose in life when they're young, in their teens and early 20s, and I think these loners are vulnerable to this exploitation, to being radicalized and then used as a tool by the people who've radicalized them. And we've just been talking about why that might be. So I think that's a fundamental issue, but it's very, very difficult to identify whether a young man is going to be, who is a little bit of a loner, is vulnerable to radicalization, of course.
Right.
There's another element to this, and this I talk about in the UK perspective. And that is that I was born in Kenya in 1963. And when I was 5 years old, I came to the UK. There's still part of me that feels some affiliation to Kenya. And I could not speak English until I was 6 years old. I spoke Swahili. Now, in the case of some of these young lads from the Pakistani community or Pakistani origins in the UK, they are looking for their identity. They maybe have been born here, but their parents or their grandparents were born somewhere else. Maybe their home culture relates more to Pakistan than it does to the UK. And so they are a little bit confused. So they're trying to identify where their place in society is. And I think that is something that we have not done enough about to address in the UK. This sort of this bringing together of all the people here living in the UK under one umbrella as one community as British,
Right.
and so they're confused. They're trying to find a role and a purpose.
Trying to find a role, and you do more as a policy matter to help them assimilate in society better and find their own identity and be part of a larger group. With that, we've come to the end of this part of the show. I just want to thank you, Mr. Bolton, and of course, Dr. Zaheer and Mr. Travers for having this discussion. There's a lot of points to cover, but unfortunately, we don't have that much time. We'll take a quick short break here. We'll be back with another update from Iraq. Welcome back to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. Now, the Prime Minister of Iraq has resigned and his resignation has been accepted by the parliament. Moving forward, there will be a caretaker government until the new government comes into place. Till then, protests continue and 50 people have died in the past 48 hours alone. The concern really that we're addressing here is whether Prime Minister Mahdi's resignation is the right step forward, or the question really is, who is going to lead now this rudderless ship? Talking to us today, we have Mr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen joining us from London, and Mr. Saad Al-Muttalibi, an Iraqi politician, joining us from Baghdad. Welcome to both of you. I want to start with you, Mr. Saad, if we can get your take on what this resignation for the Iraqi people means.
In reality, it's just one of the conditions that were set by the demonstrators. So it's a milestone, but it's not the ultimate target by the demonstrators. The youth in Iraq, they have a different view of the world as we, the older generation, have. And they think that Iraq should be, with its capabilities and financial resources, should be on the same level as the first world countries. Of course, neglecting the fact that we have inherited a dictator regime and 16 years of internal war, civil war, and corruption, and a great deal of problems, including political problems and political disagreement on how to run the country. But nevertheless, the youth have the right to dream for a better state, and their demands include and not only the resignation of the government, but actually they are speaking of changing the shape of the political regime. They're thinking that, or they understand that the failures or part of the failures in Iraq is caused by the parliamentarian system. And they compare the politics in Baghdad to that of Kurdistan. In Kurdistan, they have a presidential regime with the president directly elected by the people of Kurdistan, where in Iraq, in Baghdad, the prime minister, who is the chief of staff or the chief of armed forces, is elected or selected from the parliament and not directly from the people. And the process of selecting a prime minister through the parliament opens the way for horse dealing, for corruption, for agreements on how to divide the ministries and divide the wealth and the authority among the ruling parties.
But
and that's
to interrupt you there, Mr. Saad, sorry to interrupt you, but while Prime Minister has resigned, at the same time, wouldn't this suggest that there would be more resignations in tow? I mean, we are raising concern here about maybe the same faces showing up in different positions. But if there are going to be more resignations at a time where there have been unprecedented protests, I mean, over 400 people have been killed in these protests, something that Iraq has not seen before in recent history, could maybe this time be different?
It's true what you say, but the Prime Minister's resignation entails the resignation of the whole government. So Iraq today have no government. No executive powers. The Prime Minister and his cabinet have all resigned.
Right.
So now the ball is at the hand of the Parliament. For the Parliament to select a new Prime Minister, but that is the problem. The youth say that the process of selecting the Prime Minister is the same process that selected Adil Abdel Mahdi, who failed in his policies. So the problem with the form of selection, the youth say that selecting a prime minister through a parliamentarian system has proven to be wrong in the last 4 governments. So that is the problem. As for the resignation, the only remaining bodies are the president and the head of the parliament. If those two resign, that means that's the end of all forms of the state in Iraq.
So the question, Mr. Nicolai, also is that this particular political system, which was established after the 2003 U.S. invasion there in Iraq, this is the main criticism here, that the system is unfair. And even if there is a caretaker government right now, it might be just a drop in the ocean with Mahdi gone, because if the system retains itself, we're going to again see the same rampant corruption. We're going to see the same faces in different positions. Is it possible to have an overhaul of the system in the current circumstances?
Well, I think this is a key issue with the protests, and it's also why protesters have warned that they may escalate the situation. Recently, some protesters have said the resignation itself is a good start, and yes, it's symbolic, but it is not enough. What we're seeing here is we're seeing a system from the protesters' perspective of entrenched corruption, unemployment, services not provided, and of course, insecurity across the country. So I think these protests are not necessarily going to stop with just a resignation. There will be, as has been pointed out, a caretaker government, but the question is, can the system be overhauled? I do believe most of the protesters, they want a system where they feel politicians are accountable, and what they are seeing is a system of entrenched corruption where those who are in power, many of them do not want that status quo to change because it means that their ability to enrich themselves will be at stake.
I'm coming back to you here, Mr. Saad, about not just the political system in place there and the timing of it, but also there are a lot of external forces here, a lot of regional players that determine the fate of Iraq's protesters right now. I mean, just looking at who the Prime Minister was, who resigned, Mr. Mahdi, we know the kind of backing he got. There's a big concern that with the kind of stakes that are here for the neighbors of Iraq, how can any balanced approach be reached that would satisfy the protesters?
This is one of the major problems that, as you've just correctly stated, there is an international conflict between Iran and the United States. And unfortunately, it's considered that Iraq is considered the battleground. So influences, international influence and regional influence is very active and very real in Iraq. And it's very naive to believe that Iraq could resolve its problems through internal agreement and neglecting the international efforts or international factors. So yes, it's very complex, the position in Iraq, and without a better understanding of the international equation and the regional conflicts that are going on at the moment, Iraq can never be safe. Mr. Maliki, in his two-term government, was adamant, and he managed to balance the relationship between Iran and the United States. As the Americans say, he held the stick right in the middle. And therefore, he managed somehow in the first 7 years of his government to be okay. But in the 8th year, or actually in the 7th year, with the conflict of Syria started, Mr. Maliki moved away from the United States and slightly towards Iran. And eventually that caused him to lose his position and for ISIS to enter Iraq. So yes, it is very difficult, very, very difficult for somebody to come up with a prime minister who understands the international politics, understands the implication of internal politics on external politics, and at the same time to be accepted by the regional powers.
And Mr. Nicolai also have the endorsement almost of these regional powers, as Mr. Saad so articulately highlighted, who is really pulling the strings here. I mean, especially in light of what has come out, what has been revealed in the Iran cables, it's very disturbing to see the kind of evidence. And I mean, there's always an acceptance of this being the state of affairs, but the evidence now surfacing in these 700 pages of documents saying the kind of say and the kind of hold that the Iranian intelligentsia has within Iraq. What is your expectation of how the next few months are going to look like from within Iraq in terms of forming a new government and appeasing the protesters?
Well, I think going back to regional influence, one of the things we saw was actually anti-Iranian slogans, anti-Iranian shouts by the protesters. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. I think also it's worth mentioning here that in April of 2019, Iraq actually signed a memorandum with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. Let's remember that the GCC was originally established as a counter to Iran after the revolution. So in other words, Iraq as a nation, or in terms of its politics, they are considering how Iran may actually influence Iraq. I think that for the government to tackle this is going to be an issue, because there has been in the past Shia clerics and leaders who have been backed by Iran or influenced by Iran, who have tried to sway the protests. But I think at this point, from the Iraqis who I know and who I've spoken to, we're getting to the point where more and more protesters are united and saying, what's best for our country? Let's end corruption. Let's not make this about sectarianism, and let's not allow Iran to continue to influence our nation. So that is an issue that the next government is going to have to take up.
And not just that issue will be taken up by the next government, but Mr. Saad, also, is this an opportunity for the current sort of, for example, Mr. Sistani, the spiritual leader for many, he's been siding with the protesters all this time, while Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei has been calling the protesters the stooges of the US and Israel, and this being an entire sort of ploy to destabilize the region, to affect Iran as well. Is this a kind of opportunity where people like Sistani will come in the forefront?
Well, I think the only personality that managed to synchronize the movement of the demonstrators and at the same time synchronize the movement of the government was Ayatollah Sistani. Ayatollah Sistani, being a non-beneficiary of the politics here, he's not involved directly in politics, and he gives only advice, and he's not tied neither to the government nor to any authority. He can give an impartial advice that people respect very much and are ready to accept his advice and act upon it. Therefore, on last Friday, he only said few words, or his representative said few words, and the Prime Minister presented his resignation. And many of the demonstrators understood the dangers that Iraq faces. As Mr. Khamenei also is right to say that there are elements in the demonstrators who are tied to external forces. I am myself involved in security in Iraq, and in the last 25 days, at the beginning of the demonstrators, for the first time, over a few million American dollars, well, quite a lot actually of American dollars, entered into Iraq through the Hawala system and was distributed among individuals that were under surveillance. So yes, there are influences, overseas influences, and therefore there are people who are fueling the demonstrators either with money or with political slogans. You have to remember the people, the demonstrators, were only calling for better services, calling for better jobs, calling for better schools and hospitals. They weren't in the beginning talking of any political slogans. And suddenly, on the 25th of October, new political slogans entered into the demonstrators, diverting the demonstration from a requirement for presenting better services into a call to the downfall of the regime, not improving or correcting the regime. But how would you,
Mr. Saad, and this is a bit of time already, but I have to get this question, how would you differentiate then that there is no connection unless there is an outside influencer taking advantage of this chaos, that there is no connection between wanting to have the government accountable for the corruption they've done, the mismanagement, the high unemployment, the basic needs that the Iraqis are not getting, and then, of course, that there should be an entire regime change?
Now, there is a difference between rehabilitation of the regime and the downfall of the regime. The beginning, the people were calling for rehabilitation, for correction of the political system. But suddenly on the 25th, the slogans changed from correction into the downfall of the regime. And that is a different thing. This is a democratic regime eventually. I mean, this is a government that was selected by the people. And this is not a dictatorship. So downfall of the government should be done through the political process, through elections, and not through coup d'etats and external financing.
Okay, Mr. Nicolai, we've run out of time, but I want to get your thoughts very quickly in just 30 seconds, if you could. Do you agree with this perspective that Mr. Saad has?
To an extent, I do, but I think also one of the issues with the protests is what they really want is they want the end, so the downfall of an entrenched system, a system of militias, corruption, and enrichment. This is a very systemic issue. It's so entrenched that I think that Iraqis have had enough of it. And really, this is why I believe that the protests are going to continue until corruption and unemployment are directly addressed by whatever government comes next.
Okay, Mr. Nicolai Due-Gundersen and Mr. Saad Al-Muttalibi, thank you so much for joining us here and giving us your view on what is the way forward for Iraqis as the Prime Minister has resigned, his resignation has been accepted, and the protests continue. We will keep you up to date with what is unfolding, not only in Iraq, but in other places around the Middle East and the world with the next episode of Newswire tomorrow. Till then, goodbye.